With UFC 300 going down this Saturday and it being considered one of, if not the most stacked fight cards in UFC history, I thought it'd be interesting to go back through some of the other most stacked fight cards throughout the 300 pay-per-views we've had in the UFC and really kind of just break them down and maybe at the end figure out which one we think is the most stacked of all time. So I'm going to be going through, I believe, 6 different fight cards in today's video. We're going to start off just with UFC 300 because it's the one everyone's super familiar with. I think from top to bottom, this is probably the most consistently stacked cards, right? When we're just looking at the star power in every single matchup. But maybe some people value the main card, the top fights a little bit higher than others. I think this one is just really strong in its depth. The main card is solid, right? Jamal Hill taking on Alex Pereira. That's a strong main event. Maybe it's not like blow your socks off type of main event for UFC 300, but it's still very solid. Zhang Wei Li, Yan Xiaonan, a solid title fight there. Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway, in my opinion, the best fight on this card. Super interesting stylistically, 2 high-level guys for that BMF title. And then Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan, high-level fight. Bo Nickel, Cody Brundage, maybe doesn't look great on the main card, but right, if you swap that out with like Yuri Prochazka, Rakic, you put that one on the early prelims, I think it makes a lot of sense. There's not one bad fight on this card, and there's also just not a fight that's not super high level. Maybe you consider the Nickel Brundage one not super high level, but I think in a few years we could be looking back at this with Bo Nickel being like a potential champ, or at the very least like a high level contender. Every other fight has someone ranked at least in the top 15 of their division, so I think depth wise the prelims here are definitely the most stacked compared to any card in UFC history. So starting off strong with 300. And then I think we have to talk about both UFC 200 and 100, the other kind of like 100 cards here. So we're going to go to UFC 200. And another one of these, super hyped up cards that maybe didn't come through with the main event. It was a title fight between Miesha Tate and Amanda Nunes. There was talk about this being John Jones, Daniel Cormier. I think there was rumblings of potentially Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz. Those did not end up coming through. I think John Jones popped. I think they pushed the McGregor one back because he was like missing media obligations. So they settled with Miesha Tate, Amanda Nunes. A good title fight. Obviously, Nunes ended up being a star. She beat Miesha Tate, but maybe not UFC 200 like main event worthy. The co-main event was probably the one people were most interested in. Brock Lesnar returning to take on Mark Hunt. Wasn't for a title, but Brock obviously one of the biggest stars in UFC history. You had Daniel Cormier, who was taking on Anderson Silva on short notice. Silva up at 205. Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar for the interim featherweight title. And then you wrap up the main card with Cain Velasquez taking on Travis Brown. This was just after Cain Velasquez lost the title. So, still someone who is viewed as a very high-level heavyweight. And then I think the prelims are also really strong here. Kat Zingano taking on Juliana Pena. Johnny Hendricks, Kelvin Gastelum, that's a high-level fight. TJ Dillashaw taking on Rafael Assunção. That was a great fight. This was right after TJ lost the belt to Dominic Cruz, so right in the middle of his 2 title reigns, and he was still pretty much in his prime. That's an absolute fire fight to be on the prelims. And then you had Sage Northcutt. This was kind of like the prospect fight. This was almost like the Bo Nickel fight of UFC 200. It just didn't necessarily work out. Sage is still super young, fighting in one championship, but at least in the UFC it didn't pan out. So I think that was the intent here, that he would be like a future superstar. You look back on this card, you gave him the platform. Didn't shake out, but I get the idea. And then the early prelims, still really strong. Diego Sanchez, Joe Lozon on the early prelims. Gegard Mousasi, Thiago Santos. And then Jim Miller was the curtain jerker. So UFC 200 was really strong. I actually think it resembles 300 just based on how stacked the prelims are. But I do think 300 probably has the main card beat. So I think the prelims, strong on both. But I do think 300 probably takes the main card, even though it doesn't have like that elite headliner. Now pivoting over to UFC 100, I think UFC 100 is probably a little bit more top heavy than the other 2 we've talked about, but maybe not as deep when we're getting into the prelims. So I think this probably had the top main event with Brock Lesnar taking on Frank Mir for the heavyweight title, and then you had George St. Pierre defending his welterweight title against Thiago Alves in the co-main event. So first 2 fights starting off great. You had John Fitch taking on Paulo Thiago. And then probably, the third most interesting fight on this card, Dan Henderson taking on Michael Bisping. Now, there were some other interesting matchups. Mark Coleman, Stephan Bonner, Jim Miller also on this card. You had the kind of like the John Jones prospect fight. I was talking about how Sage Northcutt was like the Bo Nickel of the 300 card, I think John Jones is kind of similar to that Bo Nickel fight. Young guy, you get him on this card, he's going to do big things in the future. He did come through, but some of these other matchups, aren't super notable. Tom Lawler taking on CB Dollaway. Shannon Goretti taking on Matt Grice. So they didn't go super hard on the prelims, but the top, few fights on this card are definitely very, very stacked. Now we're going to shift away from like the 100 cards, 100, 200, 300. We're going to go to UFC 205, which definitely deserves a mention here. This was Conor McGregor taking on Eddie Alvarez. Conor McGregor's double champ status shot. Obviously, the stakes are huge here. You have the biggest star in UFC history in the main event, so that does have to weigh pretty heavily here when we're looking back on this card. You also had 2 other title fights. You had Tyron Woodley defending his belt against Wonderboy Thompson. That was a super, anticipated fight at that time. Wonderboy, super exciting style. Woodley as the champ. And then you had Joanna Jędrzejczyk taking on Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Poland versus Poland in that title shot. Joanna Jędrzejczyk was super exciting. I mean, she's been exciting her entire career, but during her title reign, she was exceptionally dominant, and she was dominant in that Karolina Kowalkiewicz fight. And then the other 2 fights on the main card, Chris Weidman taking on Yoel Romero. That's a fantastic fight. And then Miesha Tate taking on Raquel Pennington. Maybe that one's not super exciting for the fans, but Miesha Tate was a champ, so it was kind of a top contender fight. Definitely some fun ones on the prelims. Frankie Edgar taking on Jeremy Stevens as the featured prelim. You had Khabib Nurmagomedov taking on Michael Johnson sitting on the prelims. That definitely ups this card. I mean, seeing Khabib on the prelims seems crazy, especially because it's not like this was super early on in his UFC career. I mean, this was a ranked fight between lightweights. He was still on the prelims. You also had Vicente Luque taking on Bilal Muhammad on the prelims. Tim Boetsch there. You had Jim Miller again. He's going to be on all 3, taking on Thiago Alves. And then the first fight of the night was Liz Carmouche taking on Caitlin Chookagian. So this card really was stacked. I think if you're interested in, the main event being super huge, this could definitely be the most stacked fight card of all time. That Conor Alvarez fight is crazy. You had the 2 other title fights. You had Weidman Romero, and then the prelims with Frankie Edgar, Jeremy Stevens, Khabib, Michael Johnson, Vicente Luque, Bilal Muhammad. A very, very, very strong card, and definitely deserves consideration to be the best one of all time. The next fight card here is going to be UFC 217, and I think this fight card's even better when you actually look at the result, right? We're trying to kind of look at this on paper, but the result of UFC 217, it may be the greatest card of all time. You had in the main event Michael Bisping taking on Georges St. Pierre. This was Georges St. Pierre's return to the octagon, I believe, after 4 years away. He was going up in weight to challenge for the middleweight title. So this was a super fight. This was, highly anticipated. Probably the second best main event we're talking about here. Maybe Brock Lesnar, Frank Mir, but me being a big GSP fan was super interested in this GSP Michael Bisping fight. And obviously it delivered, but we're kind of just looking at it on paper. Then the co-main, you had the rivalry between Cody Garbrandt and TJ Dillashaw. People were super excited about that. You had TJ Dillashaw winning that one. And then Joanna Jędrzejczyk taking on Rose Namajunas. Very, very high-level strawweight title shot. And then the rest of the main card was also super stacked. So Stephen Wonderboy Thompson taking on Jorge Masvidal. Johnny Hendricks taking on Paulo Costa. Looking back at that fight, it seems crazy because Costa just looked massively bigger than him. But Johnny Hendricks, fought for the belt multiple times. Paulo Costa was like a rising star. And then there are some decent matchups on the prelims. St. Preux going up against Corey Anderson, a very solid lightweight fight. Alexei Oleinik, Curtis Blades on the early prelims. So maybe the prelims aren't, super stacked with the depth. It might not be 6 fights deep with like great matchups, but there are definitely a few in there that were pretty interesting. And the main card really was great with those 3 title fights. And like I said, they all delivered. The belt changed hands in all 3 of those. Wonderboy Masvidal was super exciting, and then Costa just completely ran through Johnny Hendricks. Now, the final card I want to talk about here is one that happened very recently. It was actually the last pay-per-view, UFC 299, because this one is also great, on paper and the way it actually played out. Main event, Sean O'Malley taking on Chito Vera. You had that rivalry. Sean O'Malley is going to be one of the biggest stars in the UFC. I mean, he already is. If he keeps winning, he might be the biggest in the next few years. just absolutely demolished Cheeto Vera. But even if it's just on paper, you had the rivalry there. Looking back on it, I think it could age very well. The co-main, Dustin Poirier taking on Benoit Saint Denis. Dustin Poirier is an absolute legend. He was facing the up-and-comer Benoit, turned him back. You had Kevin Holland taking on Michael Venom Page, MVP making his UFC debut. Gilbert Burns, Jack Della Maddalena, Petr Yan, Song Yadong. So a very, very strong main card. Even with only one title fight, these are just super, super impressive fights. Curtis Blades taking on Jailton Almeida on the prelims. You also had Gamrot RDA, Pedro Munoz, Kyler Phillips, Caitlin Sermonera, and Macy Barber. I think Macy Barber is someone who could challenge for the title in a few years, or honestly within like the next year. And then on the early prelims, not great, but we have to remember this was a very large card. I believe this was 14 fights. So some of the other ones we've talked about had like 11, 12. So if you're kind of comparing them, you could kind of axe off the, 3 fights you don't really like. But there are still some interesting guys in the early prelims. Michel Pereira, that win was great. He could definitely be trending up moving forward. And then Robelis de Spain, who knows what his ceiling is at heavyweight. So it was a very deep card in terms of 14 fights, but you really had some high-level matchups there. So those are, I believe, the 6 fight cards that I think are probably the top contenders for most stacked. Personally, I think UFC 300 takes the cake here. I know it may not be super top heavy with the main event, the co-main event. There are definitely other cards that rival it, like Pereira Hill, Zhang Weili, Yan Xiaonan. Give me Brock Lesnar, Frank Mir, give me GSP, Thiago Alves, that main event, co-main event duo. The 205, give me Conor McGregor, Eddie Alvarez, Wonderboy Woodley. You could also say Bisping St. Pierre, Garbrandt Dillashaw. I think the top 2 fights, there are better options out there, but the rest of this card is just so stacked. The Holloway Gaethje fight is amazing. You have fighters on the early prelims where they could be main card slots on these other fight cards and we wouldn't say anything. Figueiredo Garbrandt, that could easily go on a pay-per-view main card. Like I said, really any of these fights could go on a pay-per-view main card. I really don't think you can say that about pretty much any other fight card in UFC history. So in my opinion, UFC 300 the best. We'll see if it pans out, but we're kind of just looking at it on paper, and I do think it's the best of all time. If you disagree, I'd love to hear it down below. Like I said, I do think, there are arguments if you do value those, a top tier main card, the great main event, co-main event, then there are other options out there. So let me know how you guys are feeling about this. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.